Hey, how you doing? Yeah. Yeah.
It's not really hot in here.
Yeah, you can throw your bag here.
Yeah, that'll work. And I threw my presentation on a flash drive.
Okay, I think I put it up here. So hopefully,
Oh, okay. Either way.
you see if it's here. Yeah. There's twice. I guess I downloaded 3 times. All right, so it's here. All right. Yeah, that's probably the easiest thing because I got.
Folks on Zoom. Are we
Yeah.
recording or no?
Yeah, I'm recording. Yeah. All right. I can not record.
I think that's all right.
All right.
If I say something really stupid, then we'll delete the recording later.
Yeah, yeah, I'm not gonna post it until after, so you can tell me. Like,
I don't think there's anything that's gonna be too much.
I can in fact let you edit it or let you
If
look at
worst
it
case.
if you want.
Okay.
I mean,
all the slides are pretty much public information, so.
yeah, well, I was gonna ask, but I put the slides up on the webpage. I can take them off. Like, we can do it.
Yeah, I'll let you know, yeah.
Okay, either way, it's all right.
There's some hidden slides with plan information. I don't think it's anything bad.
So, I don't know about like, if they ask questions online. It would come up as anyway, I just ignore them. I don't do that. You guys, if you're online, you have to just say something and we'll answer them, okay? Don't use the chat. Is that all right? Can you,
Class goes till 3.
yeah, so good.
I don't know how the timing's gonna go. I'll do my best to.
Yeah,
be
it doesn't
succinct.
matter. Doesn't matter much. You can go a little bit over, people will walk out. I tried to get everyone, there's 51 kids in this class, and I'm not really getting a good turnout usually. But I don't really enforce that except when someone comes to speak, and then like, maybe I'll do something into them. It's hard to tell.
Yeah.
Anyway, it doesn't matter much, but
Yeah,
so a week from Thursday, we can come out or something.
that should work.
All
Yeah.
right. That would be pretty good. I appreciate you doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty cool for people to see, you know?
Oh, it's a
I
great.
mean, it's really neat.
Absolutely. It's something you don't have an opportunity to see big
Right.
industrial equipment ever.
Oh, yeah, no one has any idea where the electricity is coming from and things, you know?
Right.
So,
And today I thought we'll kind of focus more on the power grid.
all right, yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because it's easy to take that for granted too.
all right, you guys, so Sean Beam's here from Miami Fort Power Plant. And we're gonna do a tour, not this Thursday, but a week from this Thursday. And then we'll leave like after this class and go over there. But it'd be good to get like whoever wants to do it, and even if outside the class people want to go, like, so I can have a rough idea of it, more than like, well, however many, you know.
Yeah.
And anyway, so send me an email or something. So far, I haven't gotten any emails about anybody wanting to do it. So I have to see how it goes, but
Yeah.
Anyway, so I guess I'll let Sean go. I might
Yeah.
interrupt you a lot.
Oh, that's fine.
And then interrupt with questions like, all right, so he did a BS here in chemical engineering. He was like top in his class. And then he worked and during his co-op, he worked at Zimmer, I think.
Yeah.
And then he went to work at
Cummins.
Cummins, the diesel engine in Indiana, across the border, doing their power plant, I think. And then he moved back over to the power industry because that's kind of the love of his life. And then he's kind of been there.
Moved a little bit around, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess they're gonna close the Fort Miami in like a few years, right?
Yeah.
So where are you gonna find the next coal? China's his next stop, I guess.
Yeah,
'Cause
really. Yeah, I
China's
don't
where
know.
they're building coal, so,
Right.
yeah,
No, this very well could be my last stint in coal power.
yeah.
But it's hard to say what really the future is gonna bring.
I mean, it's growing in China and then a couple of India,
Yeah.
right?
And I mean, I'm not necessarily, coal power's what it is. I'm not married to it by any means.
I mean, there's new technologies too. Japan has the gas, where they gasify and everything.
Right.
I guess China has that too.
Yeah, we've tried that a little bit here, but it
Yeah.
not with great success.
I mean, the question is like how much money you can make from it, right? So it's kind of like if you can't make money off it compared to gas.
Right.
So, or solar even, but
Right.
so it's kind of like, then it's not gonna, even with the gasification thing, which looks pretty good. I mean,
Yeah.
Gasification looks pretty sweet. Like you can capture all the carbon
Right.
and you can convert to clean fuels. So you basically end up with a gas plant at the end.
Right.
With a,
You've got a really big processing plant up front.
Yeah.
That's complicated, more complicated than the gas turbines on the back end.
yeah. So it's kind of like, I mean, South Africa did that a long time ago, right? When that apartheid was running. So they took tons of all their engine fuel and their whole petrochemical was driven off coal. Like because they gasified, so they had a whole system to do that, but then they threw it away once they got apartheided.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is that Fisher trope?
Yeah.
That Germany revolutionized? Yeah. World War II.
Yeah, when there was a blockade on South Africa, and they had tons of coal near Johannesburg, north
Okay.
of it, and they just they switched over to just using that for all their gasoline, diesel.
Interesting.
Yeah, so they did it. You know,
Yeah.
it's possible to do.
Right.
But then the
I don't-
question is economics and things.
Right.
Anyway,
And the use of coal for liquid fuels,
Mhm.
there's challenge. I mean, there's challenges all over.
Yeah, I mean, the mining itself, you know,
Right.
is kind of like there's a possibility to do a tour of it. There's a coal mine like east of where you are.
Okay.
I mean, west of where
West,
you are.
yeah.
Yeah, like past Louisville.
Yep. That would make sense.
So I guess you can, I don't know if you guys buy coal from them. I forget the name of it. It's right on the river.
Yeah.
We just load coal barges right up on the river.
Right. Yeah. We buy our coal from a mix. Some of it comes from Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and some of it is more from Illinois.
I see.
I've actually never been to a coal mine. So
Yeah, and maybe if we go there, I have to talk like 5 students into going, you know,
yeah.
but it's like a 3-hour drive or something.
Yeah.
from here.
Yeah.
So it'd have to be on a Saturday. But anyway, if we go there, I'll let you know. Maybe
Okay.
you could go along.
Yeah.
I think it'd be kind of interesting.
Oh,
to
I
see.
bet. I think coal mines are small. I've been in a limestone mine, which was
yeah.
cavernous. It was really impressive.
Oh, that's pretty neat.
There's a couple of them here,
Oh,
less than an hour away.
well, that's pretty
But
neat.
yeah,
Oh, I have to look that up.
yeah, it was really impressive.
Huh.
It's kind
Yeah.
of scary though, going 600 feet underground.
I know the salt, like under the Finger Lakes, you know, there's salt mines.
Uh-huh.
And they under the entire lake, there's these big lakes, and under the entire lake, it's hollow. You know?
Really?
Yeah,
Where
they've
it's
taken the salt out.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, they've removed it for road salt.
Yeah, interesting.
Apparently you can tour that. It's supposed to be impressive, but limestone sounds interesting.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right, so
pretty
I'll
neat.
let you go ahead with
Okay.
your stuff, but
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Beaucage. So, yeah, as he mentioned, I've graduated from UC right at a decade ago, which is scary how long it's been. And I've been in the power industry for roughly 7 of the last 10 years. I've had some opportunities to work in engineering, maintenance, and now I'm the environmental and chemistry manager at Miami Fort. So I've gotten back into plant chemistry, which is sort of where I started 12-ish years ago as a co-op student. So today, though, I kind of wanted to focus on something I don't touch day to day, and it's more on the power grid and a little bit of background and some of the stresses that the power grid has seen. Because I think people, understandably, they take it for granted that they're always going to have electricity. And there have been some events in recent history that have actually come pretty close to major failure. And I think it's interesting, and I think it's worth other people knowing about. And then I've got a little bit on the energy transition in this region and kind of what could be expected there, which I think is also pretty interesting. And then if we have time, I wanted to talk through just a few minutes on deregulation in the state of Ohio. If nothing else, because I think a lot of people don't understand what energy choice means. And if you pay an electric bill in the state of Ohio, you actually do have a choice on your energy supplier. And I think people don't necessarily know that. And right now, it's a really great time to switch because of some economics at play. That may not be useful to you guys, or it may, I don't know. But if you're not paying a power bill now, you presumably will someday. So quickly to run through the kind of the markets. So in the United States, there are all these regions, and it's made up of independent system operators and these other regulated areas. So we're located in PJM here, which covers basically from Illinois, Indiana, all the way to the East Coast. Originally was Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland, which is where its name came from. But PJM essentially has control over the power grid in this region. They don't own the power grid. The actual T&D companies, so in this case, it's Duke Energy, actually owns the wires, but PJM works with Duke to operate them, and PJM ultimately calls the shots when things go wrong. A quick talk on energy mix, because this will become relevant. As I think you guys can imagine, coal-fired power in this country is declining in use. PJM, they are based out of Valley Forge, so close to Philadelphia. Yep. Coal has really declined quite a bit, and the reality is in the last few years, natural gas has picked up that slack with the fracking and horizontal drilling that really became prevalent in 08, 09. We've seen natural gas production in the United States just absolutely explode. We see here a little bit of a drop in nuclear too, and then renewables are starting to pick up, as well as demand response, which I'll talk through a little bit later, which is actually paying customers to not use energy when the need arises. And then in Texas, they're actually advancing really aggressively in renewables, which to me wasn't really intuitive when I think of what Texans stand for. But ERCOT is the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. They're actually their own independent system operator fully in Texas. Because they don't cross state lines, they have less regulation than everybody else, which I would expect from Texas. But what we've seen there is wind has just picked up like crazy. You look at, in the last 12 years, it's gone from 8% to 1/4. Coal has dropped quite a bit and gas has picked up some. But the renewables story really is the strongest right now in Texas and in California. And there's some really neat effects, and there's also some concerns with that. Real fast, and I may end up skipping this example for the sake of time, but I just kind of wanted to show the power grid here, just because most people have no idea. So this shows the 345 kilovolt transmission lines. These go to the major power plants. So you'll see there's nothing really that goes right into downtown Cincinnati, but around the city, there's quite a bit. The reason for that is folks don't, want big transmission lines in the city. But what you can kind of see here is you've got lines clustered around this area, which is where Miami Fort sits. You had power lines sitting here that cluster. This is where the Beaucage power plant, which is a retired Duke Energy facility, sits. You've got some clustered down here, which is the former Zimmer power plant that I've spent much of my career at. And then you see power lines running down here, which gets into some other coal-fired units in South Central Ohio.
What's the value of that system? Is it need to rebuild that?
Oh my gosh, I don't know. I really don't have any. For them to add power lines, you're probably talking millions of dollars a mile. I don't know how many though. PJ, it's a lot of copper. I'm not sure that they use copper. They might be aluminum, but it's a lot. It's a significant amount of metal, whatever it is. And the towers themselves are hundreds of feet tall, and you've got to maintain huge clearance at these high voltages. So kind of zooming in on the 69 kV plus, so this is smaller voltage, you actually start to see lines running into the city, but these are obviously going to carry less power overall, being at a lower voltage. And then the reason I touched on Columbus here, so I'll kind of move through this quickly. What we see is there are power lines that run into Columbus, but there really aren't that many big power plants in Columbus. You've got power coming from the Cincinnati area. You've got these big power plants down here in Southern Ohio. And then you don't see it here, but up north, there's a couple large power plants on Lake Erie, a couple nuclear units. So what that means is Columbus is sort of in a position where if they were to lose some transmission lines, they can be in trouble as far as bringing power into the city. There was an instance last summer when that actually happened. So before that, really fast, I just wanted to talk through these emergency procedure levels. PJM talks about warnings, alerts, and actions. Actions are what we really care about because that means somebody needs to respond to a threat on the power grid right away. And then on the left here, I showed these EEA levels, which are emergency energy alert levels. Emergency EEA1 means that essentially they're going to call on every power supply in the area. EEA2 means we're going to start actually curtailing large customers. So you're going to tell customers they need to reduce their electrical consumption if they've agreed to it, which is demand response. And then EEA3 means there's imminent rolling blackouts that are coming. So EEA3 is what, we've seen that, and that means people are going to be losing their power for a certain amount of time. And then the reality is if you don't go into EEA3 and you need to, you end up with cascading failures and the grid goes black, which is why these energy alerts are in place. So last June, I was sitting at my desk at Zimmer. We just retired the plant 2 weeks earlier, and I noticed kind of some oddities in PJM. So naturally, I wasn't super busy because the plant was shut down and we were just cleaning some stuff up. So I started going out on the internet looking for news articles because I started to see PJM alerts come in. And the news at the time had no idea what was going on, but all they knew was AEP, there were something like 250,000 customers in Columbus that had no power. It was 95 degrees, and AEP at the time wasn't saying a word. What we found out later, what I knew right away, what the media found out later was PJM was actually directing AEP to shut off customers because they were overloading the grid in Columbus. They did it for 3 days. And it's the first time in my career that I've actually seen in this region people having their electricity cut off because there wasn't enough power available. So this is what I saw that day. And I think I took a screenshot of it like that week because it kind of blew me away. This doesn't mean a lot to you guys, but when you start seeing load shed directive and mitigating thermal overloads, they were actually overheating transmission lines. And PJM's fear is when one transmission line trips, if it causes the next one to overload and trip, they'll actually do a simulation where they'll go 5 lines out. And if they show overloads over 5 lines, they'll actually start forcing customers to cut power because the fear is you're gonna lose the entire grid.
So they're using too much and it heats the wires up, they slack down or something?
There's that as well. Yes, they can actually drop. Yeah, that caused the outage of 2003, which you all wouldn't remember, but there was a massive outage in the Midwest and a little bit into New England back then. Yep. That was caused by one transmission line that invoked a cascading failure. So, this is the first time I'd seen all this. It kind of, it really surprised me but the reality was we'd had some severe storms roll through the night before and AEP was having issues with transmission lines. So this was not that there wasn't enough electricity out there. They couldn't push that power into Columbus quickly enough. So they actually showed, power got up to a pretty elevated level, about 21 gigawatts, and they had to start shedding load. This is kind of going back. PJM has to report what's going on. So they talked about initiating load shed directives and concerns of these N5 cascade overloads. So, this was all clear later, but at the time, people just knew their power was off and they didn't know why. And that might be all I had on this one. Yeah. So this is kind of the first time for a transmission related issue. And what I wanted to highlight here is the transmission systems are often 40, 50, 60 years old. And severe weather, if it knocks them out, you can get effects on the grid right away. So our transmission system is threatened in that regard. I haven't seen anything like this in this region since then. I wanted to move to kind of a bigger incident. And this was Winter Storm Elliott last Christmas. So I don't know if you guys remember, it was like 40 degrees on the 23rd. That night, it rained all afternoon, turned to ice and then snow. It was 4 or 5 degrees the next morning. And it really stayed cold through Christmas. So this kind of shows wind chills, but you know, we were about 20 below, 25 below. You had, you know, 5 and 10 below as far south as Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas. You know, single digit wind chills in Florida. Pretty extreme cold, and the winds were fairly strong as well. And you get out here, I can't even imagine these pushing -50 wind chills out west. But this was another big incident on the power grid where, so to put in perspective, PJM has 186,000 megawatts of generation, and a megawatt's going to power 200 to 500 homes. So I mean, you're talking millions and millions of homes, which makes sense. On December 24th, 24% of that capacity was unavailable to make electricity. So almost 47,000 megawatts. And what was interesting that I find I kind of giggled at the time, not that it was a joke, but the vast majority of that was natural gas. And in this region, like, natural gas has been hailed as the solution. You know, shut down coal plants, build more gas plants. The natural gas is cleaner, more efficient, easier to work with, which is all true. But not always reliable when you need it. So PJM they put together like a 200-page report that I've summarized here in a couple slides. These are outage rates. So when a unit's expected to come online or raise load and it can't, it goes into an outage state. You can see on the 23rd, there was about 10,000 megawatts of outage. Most of that was coal. And 24 hours later, 26 hours later, we were up to 46,000 megawatts. So we're talking dozens of large power plants that were expected to come online late on the 23rd, early on the 24th. They just simply didn't start. Yeah.
Why did they not start? I know this is a storm, but what are some more detailed logistics about that?
Yeah, so I didn't put that information in here, but primarily the gas-fired units could not procure fuel. So unlike a coal unit where we have a pile of coal sitting on the ground that we can burn whenever we'd like, the gas units have to schedule fuel. They don't store it. And some of them have firm contracts and some of them have interruptible contracts. If you have a firm contract of natural gas, you're going to pay more for that gas all the time, but you're guaranteed to get it. If you have an interruptible contract, obviously it's cheaper, but they can turn you off. So at home, everyone that has natural gas at home, that's a firm gas contract. They can't call you and tell you they're shutting off your gas. The big industrial customers, they can, because they want to pay less for it. A lot of these folks didn't have firm gas. A lot of them did have firm gas, and the gas companies said, we don't have enough gas in the pipes. We're going to send that gas to people's homes so they don't freeze. You're not getting the gas you pay for. The other thing is when it gets this cold, you just have equipment issues with sensors that freeze up. You could have any kind of water piping that freezes. And if it's a critical system in the plant, it could knock the plant off. So it was a mixture of equipment failures and fuel supply. We also saw, we didn't see this at Miami Fort, but wet coal will freeze, and it'll freeze like a rock, and then sometimes you just can't. If it freezes inside a silo and all of a sudden you can't move it, you're screwed as well. So, but this many outages, like there's 48,000 megawatts out in PJM today because we're in October and we don't need the load, so people are doing maintenance. I've never seen this many outages in a winter period or a peak summer period. and neither had PJM for what it's worth. Quick talk on renewables here. So wind was phenomenal during Elliott. It was windy as this front was moving through. So we see the U cap and the I cap. The I cap would be like the maximum amount of power that a wind turbine could make. You're very rarely going to hit that. But it was well above that U cap, which is what they would expect on a typical day. So wind did great. Solar did okay. The challenge with solar is, of course, it only produces power when it's daylight. So in the middle of a winter storm, when there's snow on the solar panels, when it's cloudy, or when it's not daylight, those units are useless. So solar, I mean, anything was good, but solar wasn't great. Wind really was helpful though. PJM really struggled. And this is what surprised us. Of course, me, my boss, my team were communicating hourly during this storm because we needed to keep our units online. So PJM forecasted like 125,000 megawatts of load. It turns out it was closer to 140,000. So when they don't know how much power is going to be needed, they don't schedule plants. Plants don't expect to come on. They're less likely to actually come on. What they showed down here was PJM trying to save face. Compared to the normal Christmas Eve valley, they call it. So the night before Christmas Eve, the highest amount on the grid was 85,000 megawatts. Well, it was over 120 last Christmas Eve. So just an incredible amount of electricity needed. We saw here the same thing on the 24th, where just this huge gap between what they forecasted and what actually was needed. So their under forecasting hurt them big time. I'll talk through this really quick. This is a busy slide and they had a lot of technical talk on this, but what PJM actually showed was on this graph, you've got time at the bottom, and then that they call the ACE is the area control error. This actually shows like how close is PJM managing the grid as far as how much energy is being produced versus how much is being consumed. And in a nutshell, if you're below the line at 0, you're actually going to be running under frequency. So our grid operates at 60 hertz. You'll be running, maybe 59.95, 59.9. And the lower that ACE gets, the lower the frequency is. So there's backstops in here where reliability requirements would say, if you have unit trips and your ACE drops below a certain point, you have to recover within 15 minutes. And what they showed here was, and they show all this is at 6 o'clock on the 23rd, or I'm sorry, this is more like 5 to 6. They were losing units left and right because of the cold. They actually started requesting shared reserves, trying to import power from other parts of the region. They got into this point where they had 15 minutes to restore the frequency, and they actually failed to do that. So it took about 16 minutes for them to recover. But PJM at this point was importing as much as they could, which neighboring units would only offer power in 30-minute windows. So, they requested power a half hour later, they had to roll it back. And I can't imagine being in PJM's control room at this time, but it had to be an incredibly stressful point. But at this point, they were requesting any unit maximum emergency generation. They'd already gone to the Department of Energy and requested, and this is common, they'll basically get a waiver on any environmental limits for any power plant in the region. They'll go to the DOE and say, we need plants to run and exceed their emission limits. The DOE will give them a waiver to do that for as long as needed. So plants can abandon their environmental controls if need be to stay online. But they showed here closer to 6 o'clock, they were able to get the ACE back positive and bring the grid back into some stability for that point. Since then, they've had some new requirements because they failed to meet this contingency event recovery period window that was federally mandated. Demand response, I show more these emergency load management reduction actions. So PJM went out and actually procured as much demand response as they could. So they told all their customers back off on load. They appealed to the public to turn their heat down, do whatever they could to use less electricity. But the reality here was they called for 7,500 megawatts of demand response, and they only got 2,400. So they essentially didn't even get what they requested on demand response. So let's see here. What that meant was they had every power plant maximum generation. They had as much demand response. They called every demand response resource they had. And essentially it still wasn't enough. So their options were to either start shedding load within PJM. And what that would mean is they would call Duke Energy and they would say, hey, Duke Energy, we need 100 megawatts of load. You have 10 minutes, 5 minutes, start disconnecting customers and do whatever you need, but get 100 megawatts off in 5 minutes. And what they would do then is they would disconnect one region for say 20 minutes, then they'd switch to another region for 20 minutes, and people would just start losing electricity. The other thing they can do is they can start cutting exports. So PJM's selling power to other regions. And what we saw here, which was kind of interesting, you have your non-firm exports and your firm exports. So the firm exports, we contractually agreed we would make, in this case, this is TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, we would provide them 2 megawatts of firm exports. And on the early morning hours of the 24th, PJM went to TVA and said, your firm exports are no longer firm, we're cutting you off. So thankfully in this case, actually TVA had seen on the 23rd, they had some load shed events. I'll show those in a second. But we were able to provide the exports then, which was helpful. We were not able to provide them later when they needed that power again. Also with Duke, we had roughly 3,000 megawatts of exports, PJM did. And they cut them early on the 24th. But at the moment they cut these firm exports, Duke Energy Progress and Carolinas, which is your North and South Carolina grid, they went into load shed. So customers were, I think Duke said 150,000 customers were turned off in North Carolina that morning. Duke quickly told the media that PJM failed to meet its obligations, and that's why we're cutting off people's power, trying to save face. But both of these events with TVA and Duke Energy, they noted were the first time either company has ever had to turn off people's electricity because there was not enough electricity on the grid. So we think about the energy transition and how things are moving forward. The grid is not necessarily as reliable now as it's been in the past. And I don't think very many people realize that.
Why is it less reliable now than?
So that in this case with Winter Storm Elliott, gas supplies weren't as good as people thought. So as you transition a grid away from coal into natural gas, if your gas is not available when you really need it, you're not going to have electricity. Because of competition with heating and the lack of transmission infrastructure.
Like no one's heating with coal.
No, right, no one's heating. Exactly. And the gas pipelines, nobody wants to build new gas pipelines because no one wants to dig up, and understandably so. It's a very disruptive thing to put in 24, 36-inch gas mains anywhere. So it's
Yeah, Cincinnati's been going through protests.
yeah, they're actually putting some lines. Yeah, they're putting lines in Claremont County now to feed, but those are 8-inch lines. They're not nearly as big, but they've torn up all sorts of land burying pipe. So financially, just super quick, you can see where power prices were on the 21st and 22nd. This is in $1,000 per megawatt hour. So power prices are typically 20, 30, 40 bucks. During the winter storm, we saw $3,700 a megawatt hour. So this is the equivalent. So you guys right now, a retail rate of electricity is 10 to 15 cents. At that moment, you'd be paying something like $3.70. So if people were buying purely on the market, which you can't do in this region, but you would be talking about spending $40, $50 an hour on electricity at home, probably. So you'd be looking at thousands of dollars over those couple days. So once the emergency events ended, we were back down. Power was still $400 or $500 through Christmas, and then it eventually settled back in as it warmed up. The other thing are these capacity penalties, which I don't have enough time to really go into, but essentially the generators in PJM are paid for the ability to make electricity. And if they're needed in an emergency and they don't make electricity, they get penalized. This is the first time in PJM's history with this capacity program that the entire region went into a capacity, what we call a performance assessment interval, where they'll actually tell you if you have a capacity obligation, you have to meet it. In short, what that meant was the generators, like the plant I work at, were assessed $1.8 billion over these 2 days for not making electricity when it was required. The cool part was the way PJM works this is that money doesn't just become PJM's. They take all the generators that made extra electricity and they'll pay them a bonus. So Vistra, the company I work for, Luminant, I don't think it's been public yet how much money we made or lost, but I can tell you it was in the tens of millions of dollars. Some of our plants were running and ran great and they got a big bonus. Some of our plants were not running and they took a massive penalty, but all in all, we did make some money, which meant other utilities were not on the positive side. And I think a couple of them did declare bankruptcy after this event because it was enough that they couldn't sustain operations with these penalties. So that's everything with Winter Storm Elliott. I'm really thankful and glad that our Miami Fort Cole units ran incredibly well. And my boss likes to brag about this all the time, but we really didn't have any issues when we were needed most. The plant was rewarded handsomely financially, but also it meant we were doing our part when people needed electricity to survive, frankly. So that felt good. Some of our other units in the fleet, our gas units primarily, some of them struggled quite a bit. To kind of shift gears, I wanted to get into some details about Texas, but I didn't think we'd have time, so I kind of went high level. Up on the left, this is California. This was like back in 2015, they did a projection. No, this isn't a projection. This is actually real data from this year back. And then this lower chart is in Texas, what they're predicting for 2031. So it's just a projection. But what we see is this is on a spring day right now. This is all the power that's needed by your conventional plants minus solar. So every day, California in the spring needs 15, 20,000 megawatts. And about 7 a.m., that number starts plummeting to the point now in 2023 where in the middle of the afternoon, they actually don't need any electricity at all because their grid is 100% solar, which is cool. I mean, it's a great thing to say at times they're 100% renewable. The challenge is about 6 o'clock, the sun sets and all that solar goes away in an hour and a half. So now you have to take basically plants not running and ramp them back up to 20,000 megawatts in an hour and a half period. It's easier said than done. The plants, there's not much coal out in California, but even the gas plants and especially the nuclear plants don't really ramp up that quickly. They were not designed to ramp up. The grid was not built with this assumption that it was going to basically turn itself off every day. So this is a big concern because solar is continuing to grow down there. In Texas, we're seeing the same thing. My company's headquartered outside of Dallas, and we're the biggest power producer in the state of Texas. So we hear a lot about what they're up to. But they're showing essentially by 2030, there will be roughly 20,000 megawatts of solar. Wind does drop down basically in the middle of the day, typically in the heat of the day. But what they show here is from 19 to 2100 hours, they just show unserved, which essentially means they think there will be a deficit in the evenings. This is a projection, like I said, 10 years out. Here, these two plots show the essentially the rise of batteries and solar in California. And then I found a tweet here from 2022, basically showing that California went into EEA3 in September at about 7 or 8 p.m., which is exactly what we'd expect. At that point, they didn't have to shed load, but they were right there ready to. And then in Texas, this shows, this was a statistical analysis done at the beginning of this summer to basically show when would Texas have issues with their grid. And what they showed was every hour, the later it gets in the day, the more likely there's issues. And I don't think, so I did note it here. Earlier this month, Texas went into EEA2, called on demand response resources because there wasn't a whole lot of wind. There was about 110 degrees in Dallas, and they didn't have enough electricity as the sun went down. So Texas is bragging, and they're right. They're doing great things with solar and wind. What they're finding is when that sun sets, they can't get other sources on quickly enough to replace it. And at a higher level, what we see is that solar and wind will suppress the price of electricity. So the other units out there, the coal and gas units, in the long term are going to say, we can't make any money because power is so cheap during the day, we're not going to run these plants. And over time, the thermal generation, gas, coal, nuclear, is going to become less and less economic. And without a solution, this is going to continue to be a problem. At the end of the day, batteries are likely going to be a big part of that solution, because that energy storage that you can charge up overnight or even charge up during the day when the sun's out and quickly unload it in the evening hours is going to be the bridge to keeping things balanced. Some sort of energy storage, whether it's batteries or otherwise. And I kind of transitioning there, PJM released this really nice energy transition document earlier this year, talking about risks. And essentially what they're showing is 40 gigawatts of retirements in the next 8 years, and 48 to 94 gigawatts of solar and wind coming in. But PJM recognizes that if you put in 94 gigs of solar, you're probably only going to make 17 gigs of actual electricity, because those units don't run all the time. A little bit of energy storage, 4 gigawatts at a best case, that's really not that much. Maybe some new thermal entry, which is gas, all gas. And then load growth is going to go up 11 to 13 gigs, depending on how much we electrify our transportation, how much our homes, businesses, heating, etc. When you do the math here, though, you're adding up a total of maybe 30 gigs. You have 13 gigs of load and 40 gigs of retirement. So you're still like 20,000 megawatts short. Down here, I put, and I won't go into detail here, but this kind of shows why these units are retiring. They're primarily EPA rules. And then there's some state legislation in Illinois. Illinois is really aggressive towards shutting down their conventional power plants and moving into wind primarily out there, and then keeping their nuclear units around. Kind of what we show in summary there is right now PJM, by their own metrics, they have like 22 to 26% of reserve on the grid, which we found out when you have 25% of your grid and outages, a few days before Christmas, all of a sudden your 26% reserves don't look so great. But PJM by their own forecast show by 2030, they could have between 3 and 15% reserve capacity. So they're sort of sounding the alarm that unless something changes right now, if the renewables don't really come in strong, which is what this low new entry means, these reserve margins, they admit, they're not safe to operate the grid. 8% is what they consider their minimum. So, by PJM's own analysis, they're in trouble if something doesn't change. And then down here, we kind of show the thermal generation drops off, and this chart is really misleading. But renewables will pick up, and then potentially additional renewables is the gray, but their load forecast also continues to rise. So this last little line was the summary of this is like a 30-page document, but essentially says the composition and performance of the resource mix will determine PJM's ability to maintain the reliability of the bulk electric system. And there needs to be a lot of collaboration between all the stakeholders, whether it's federal government, whether it's state agencies, consumers. It's all going to have to work together. We're not going to be able to just take for granted that everything will be fine as we transition into these renewables here in the US. So I think that was all I had. Yeah. So that was all I had, kind of talking about the grid and the future of it in this region. I wanted to take a few minutes and talk about Ohio Energy Choice, just for your guys' information. I hope this is kind of practical. I know the first part wasn't super practical. And then I can take some questions. So in '99, Ohio became deregulated with electricity and natural gas. Most of the utilities really didn't actually break up until 08 or 09. And what that means is in a regulated utility like we've got in Kentucky, Indiana, West Virginia, the utility owns the power plants, they own the wires, and they sell you the power. You have no choice. You pay what you pay, and the utility commissions, the Indiana Regulatory Council, what used to be Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, they would work with those utilities to make sure we were paying a fair rate. So they called it a regulated monopoly. You still see that with the wires in this area. Duke still owns you can't have someone else bring you electricity to your home or business. It's Duke. But anybody can sell electricity, and anybody can make electricity, and anybody can sell electricity. So I don't think I went into details. Yeah. So right now, if you don't choose your energy supplier in Ohio, Duke actually has to go out to auction and buy energy from these actual energy providers. And then they pass that energy on to you. They don't make any money in it. They're not legally allowed to make any money in Ohio. But what that means is right now, if you take what Duke calls their standard service offer, you pay right at 10 cents a kilowatt hour. 10 cents a kilowatt hour is because last year when those auctions were held, power prices were still very expensive because natural gas was very expensive last year. Now gas has changed, it's dropped, and they're a lot cheaper. So if you get online and just Google Ohio Energy Choice, or they call apples to apples, this website will come up. You go into electric, you choose your service provider, and then you can go in and actually look at different electric retail energy providers. And you can sort this by the cheapest price. So where I said you pay 10 cents with Duke, you can actually go out and theoretically get power for as cheap as 4.8 cents. So it's quite a bit cheaper. I put some of my own thoughts in here. Like I always go for fixed rate plans because if they're variable, you have no idea what they're going to do. I hate these plans with a monthly fee, and early termination fees just are frustrating in general because you don't have the freedom to move around. So when I look at like Dynegy Energy Services East, which is the company I work for, our retail branch, they have a $10 a month fee that you pay no matter how much electricity you use. I think I would stay far away from that. They do have plans that don't have that fee as well. They've got one down here. So for 5 cents, you could pay no fees, but it's a variable rate. What power is going to do? It's supposed to get more expensive in the next year. We're hoping it gets more expensive in the next year. It makes us more competitive, but we don't know. So this is out here for anybody that buys electricity in Ohio, and to go from, so in addition to that 10 cents, you may pay 5 or 6 cents for the distribution side. You can't get away from that. That's a monopoly. But if you can go from paying 16 cents to 10 or 11 cents, that's a significant savings. And a lot of people were really upset this summer when their power bills went up 50, 60 bucks. And they're blaming Duke, which really Duke had nothing to do with it. But everyone has the choice to buy from somebody else. And I think the only time people know about this is when they get junk mail or they get someone at their door saying, buy from us. And the people that go door to door are usually at the bottom of this list. They're really expensive. The groups that are cheap are not necessarily out marketing the crap out of their cheap plans. It's the groups that are really expensive that are trying to, I believe, take advantage of people. Because it's very easy to lie about what's going on here. So. Yeah.
If someone had like solar power or solar panels on the top of their house and they're making more power than they use and they want to put more power back onto the grid, what does that look like in a deregulated space like this?
So I'm not an expert there, but I believe net metering is still relevant in Ohio, which means they take any electricity you make, if you make less than you use, you basically get a credit for the amount that you made. You get a 1-to-1 credit. If you make more electricity than you used, I believe you go back to a wholesale rate of electricity. You wouldn't get paid a retail rate at 5 or 6 cents. You'd end up paying a wholesale rate, which is probably going to be 2 to 4 cents. And it's unfortunate, but I also see that somebody's got to pay to keep those wires in shape. And you having you still get the benefit of drawing as much power as you want when you're not making your own. So obviously, if somebody wants to, they can go off the grid and do battery backup. That's kind of an extreme example. Batteries are still expensive. Then you would pay no fees. But yeah, I don't think very many states will allow you to sell power back at a retail rate. It'd be great if you could. It would definitely improve the economics, but for the most part, you size your solar to try to break even or maybe just less than break even, so you don't get over that. And I think here you might have 12 months to break even. So you may know, seasonally in the summertime, you're going to make more solar because it's sunnier out and you have longer hours. So you may net positive in the summer, but net negative in the winter because it's cold, you're using more electricity. So all that information is out there, but it's not necessarily easily accessible on what the actual laws say. I don't remember what else I had here. Oh, okay, yeah. So that's really all I had today, and I didn't go over time, so I'm glad for that. Do you guys have any questions or anything before I talk a little bit about the tour next week? Yeah.
So a couple of slides ago, we talked about I don't necessarily know what it was, but there's something between it was fixed and then a word, basically saying that the gas getting to the plants.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think that there will ever be a time, like how we talk about the reliability of the grid, not getting enough power to customers, that it might be something where you enroll in a utility plan that's a fixed plan, or the other option, which is like if you need to be cut off, like you're paying less, but you might get cut off if other people need power?
That's a good question. So some of that has actually existed. So there were some residential plans for demand response, and how that was handled. I enrolled in it a couple of years back. Duke offered it in Ohio, where They actually came out and they put a relay on my air conditioner compressor outside. So at Duke's discretion, they could actually cut power to my air conditioning. And they had stipulations up to 30 minutes every 2 hours or something. And every time they cut that power, I think they gave me like a $2 or $3 bill credit. And in my mind, it was like, well, I can lose my air conditioning for a half hour for $3. And they actually offered that. So you could sign up in specific instances. They're considering doing the same thing with water heating. So if you have an electric water heater, which is becoming rare because they're inefficient and they're just inefficient. There are some groups out there that actually will put a box on your water heater and turn it on and off remotely and somehow compensate you for that. As far as shutting off your whole, like everything in your house, I doubt it. But I think there will be programs because as this demand response becomes more valuable, right now it's the industrial customers, it's the big facilities that, in manufacturing that could say, hey, we'll cut off power because we're going to save megawatts just at our facility. And there's quite a bit of revenue there. I'm curious to see how it goes in the future. I hope so, because that is part of the solution. And I think, people, they're seeing this in Texas quite a bit because Texas is more aggressive in demand response, where you can buy thermostats like the Nest thermostat has integration, where you can give control to your utility to actually turn up your thermostat if you choose. A lot of people, that really rubs them the wrong way, and they feel like no one should tell them how to use their electricity. That's fine, but if we get into EEA3, they're going to turn people off whether they like it or not. There's no choice anymore. So doing your part. So when these conservation alerts come out, PJM did them last Christmas. They went to the media and said, tell everybody, cut back on electricity if you can. Do you need to do laundry today? Do you need to run your dishwasher? I don't know if they went into this, but if you have an electric water heater, can you, take your shower in the afternoon, not first thing in the morning? It was on Christmas Eve. And those appeals for conservation matter because when there's nothing left, that could be the difference between rotating blackouts and not. So I didn't talk about Winter Storm Uri, which was 2021 in Texas. It was the most well-known event where they had rotating blackouts and they had problems with the rotating and people lost their power for maybe not days, but big chunks of time. And in Texas, houses aren't insulated. When it was 5 or 10 degrees, homes froze up and people died. It was really bad. Our plants ran remarkably well, but Vistra, because of that retail versus wholesale pricing split, I think we took like a $1.7 billion hit as a corporation. And my bonus was sort of wrecked last year because of it, and rightfully so. But in that case, in Winter Storm Uri, we actually saw that frequency. When we talk about ACE, that frequency got so low, they're hit at a couple of units. If your frequency gets too low, the generators will actually disconnect from the grid to protect themselves because they're designed to run at 60 hertz. And I think at one of our big nuclear units in Texas, they were like, the frequency got so low, it started a timer. I think it was a 15-minute timer that said, if the frequency doesn't recover, the unit's going to trip itself offline. And that was like 2,000 megawatts. And had that happened, as soon as you lose a big unit, your frequency drops even further. There was real concern in Texas that they could have lost the entire Texas grid during Winter Storm Uri, which it could take days or a week or 2 weeks to restart the grid. So the death toll would have been massive, I believe. I'm only speculating, but it would have been really terrible. Yeah.
So like with that, there was like obvious issues with Texas's grid, and it seems like our grid is continuing to like not be as good. So as like a power plant and a power company, do you guys like advocate for the grid to be updated and stuff? Like how is that Like, why isn't it getting fixed?
Yeah, we have like lots of lobbyists that are working in Washington to try to explain this information, that our grid is not as stable as it once was. We're absolutely advocating for a diverse energy portfolio. And really where we also push is with the EPA directly, because these regulations that I didn't get into detail, nope, they're higher up, sorry. There are environmental regulations and they're somewhat crippling, like they have great intentions. Sorry, guys. Oh, there we go. This EPA coal combustion residuals effluent limitation guidelines. These are what are shutting down Miami Fort in 2027. This EPA good neighbor rule is currently in federal court right now being disputed. But these environmental regulations make a lot of sense, and they're promoting the development of renewables because they're going to make power more expensive. But in the short term, they could be very risky. What we've seen is these independent system operators, if they believe a unit cannot retire, they'll put it in what's called a reliability must run condition, an RMR. They'll tell the unit under the authority of the Department of Energy, you cannot shut your facility down. The Department of Energy will trump the EPA in that regard. And they'll continue to operate regardless of their permits, their environmental permits. But that's kind of a rare thing.
Is it like heating the river up, or is it heavy metals?
Yeah, so effluent limitation guidelines are primarily on metals and wastewater. Yep. And the latest rules, the challenge with these environmental rules, and I could talk for another hour about environmental rules. They change so often based on the administrations. You may think you're compliant, and then they completely rewrite the rule and you're not compliant. So if you spend a whole bunch of money, and I'm talking a whole bunch, tens of millions of dollars, and then you find out that you have to spend another 10, 20, $50 million. What these utilities are saying is that's too big a risk. We'll just shut the plant down. So yeah, effluent limitation guidelines are on mercury, arsenic, selenium, and nitrite in wastewater. All bad things. I've spent a lot of my career in managing mercury emissions from power plants, and I feel really good about that because mercury in the air and mercury in the water is a terrible thing. And the plants I've worked at and managed have had the potential to emit quite a bit of mercury. But it comes at a cost. This coal combustion residuals rule is about how you manage ash. And there have been some catastrophic failures of ash ponds at power plants that have released ash into the environment, and coal ash is nasty stuff. It's not hazardous waste, but it's full of things that you don't want in the environment. So there's good reason, but if their solution is we'll just transition to gas, then the gas grid needs to be hardened so that you don't have these issues. And that's kind of where we're at. Gas is cheap, so everyone flocks to it, but you can't necessarily count on it. So I wanted to talk about this tour for just a moment, if any of you guys are planning to come out. The plant, here's the address, and I'll put this on the website. It's about a 35-minute drive from here. We'll provide the hard hats and safety glasses. Next week, I'm not sure if we're going to actually be operating because we have both units online right now. But with the cool down this weekend, we may not be economic, so we may be shut down, which makes it easier to talk. It's kind of cool to see the plant actually running, but it is a little bit of an easier tour when it's not. It's a somewhat dangerous place, so we'll make sure we discuss any potential risks. We started up one unit this week and brought it back down a day later because we had a pretty bad steam leak. We were blowing 2,500 PSI steam into the building, and we're worried if the line ruptured, we'd fill the entire building with steam and hurt some people, so we quickly took the plant back off. Put a little map in here showing the plant and how to get in, because it is a little bit confusing.
Yeah. This is sign, I think.
There are some signs, but it's a little bit confusing, yeah.
It's
Because you have,
kind of like part of it's torn down or something.
well, there's a little bit torn down up here, but there's like the visitors check-in area is not where you actually enter the plant, so you have
But
to
the
go.
guard tells you where to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully,
Yeah. Yeah, that worked out.
yeah. So, yeah, I think the last time, what did we have, maybe 6 or 7 folks come about a year ago?
Yeah. I think
And it was,
might have been a little more.
it may have been a little more. I've given some tours from here. I gave a tour of some students from Cedarville.
It is pretty noisy. Like, when you
Parts,
get here,
parts are noisy. If
you're
we're not,
just seeing the size of the machines, that's
Oh,
kind of what
yeah.
I got out of it. Then
Yeah.
climbing up to the top.
looking
There's an
out,
elevator.
yeah, oh yeah, there's an elevator.
Yeah, so it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Dr. Beaucage's experience with floor grading it's improved since the first tour we gave. I remember a Zimmer,
Yeah, I closed my eyes now.
if you're not used to floor grading, it's a little bit, I mean, when you look down and you look 150, 200 feet down beneath your feet, it's a little disconcerting if you haven't seen it before, but it's safe. It's just a little spooky. So, yeah, we've got a lot of big equipment. And it's an opportunity to see something that, you know, the public doesn't typically get to see.
I'm wondering if in the future it all exists, you know?
Well, there's,
It's almost like, you know.
Maybe.
Except for in China and India. It might be.
Yeah. There's some coal units that I think will hang around, but
Because
not many.
gas plants are a lot less.
Yeah,
like the turbine.
right. You got a turbine, you may have a boiler behind the turbine,
Yeah.
but all the fuel handling and all the emission controls,
I mean,
It's
a
not
cooling
needed.
tower, it's like,
there usually is a
Yeah.
cooling tower. Yeah. Not as big.
yeah, that's pretty.
Yeah. So,
It's impressive how big everything is.
Yeah.
And the quantity of material it goes through. and
right.
It's a lot of material.
It's a lot of material handling. Yes. Yep. We kind of joke that if you've never worked at a solid fuel plant, it is if all you've worked at is gas plants or even liquid fuel, they're much harder to operate when you actually have to move coal and move ash, and it's a lot of practical issues. If you can't move ash, you shut the plant down. If you can't bring in coal, you shut the plant down. There's just a lot of challenges.
Bulldozers.
Yeah.
There's a lot of crazy stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's cool.
So, yeah, I'm trying to find some other folks, maybe 1 or 2 others to help with the tour next week.
So the frequency, over and over, the frequency thing, so that's like load shed, is that brownouts? or something? Or
If it gets to that point, yeah, you'll
That's
shed
how
load.
they do a brownout, it's like they change the frequency of the AC.
So they can't, I think brownouts, they'll actually reduce the voltage.
Okay,
They'll undervolt because any resistive load,
but it's how you adjust for the power supply and the power used is with the frequency.
yes.
I see.
Well,
It's fine,
you can't really adjust your frequency. You can adjust your voltage,
okay,
and that reduces power consumed because any resistive load is going to use
okay,
less power. Your frequency kind of is what it is. So to increase frequency, you have to push more power onto the grid, or you have to reduce the amount used.
okay.
And that's this gets out of my wheelhouse. My old boss, who's an electrical engineer, gets really into reactive power, and you need synchronous generators to produce reactive power. Inverters don't produce reactive power like synchronous generators. So there's a concern that solar and battery can't necessarily provide all the support without other means of either capacitor banks or what we call synchronous condensers, or yeah.
That's interesting.
The electrical stuff gets pretty complex too,
Yeah.
and that's out of my wheelhouse for sure.
Yeah, we're over time, so probably put it, Sean.
Yeah.
You'll be around. for me.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, I appreciate your time today.
You.
Yeah. It is, there's a lot. like anything, it's so complicated when you do it.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the reality.
They come in at standard.
Artificial losing power. They were changing. People had it conflicting. Obviously, we don't, want to, but you see it in the development.
Yeah.
Where power should be relied on, it's going be important.
Yeah.
Right, they do.
Actually, people really feel it. But it's kind of. I mean, it helps if if the labor is $2 a day, well, in a lot of the things you have. For the monetary stuff. Yeah, I want to create your own videos. And it's always easier if someone does all that for you. I mean, we're doing ourselves.
Yeah.
Approach, you know.
Right, right.
basically, People wouldn't think about cooking dinner, something like that, you know,
Yeah.
so